All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everybody's having a good day. We should be able to get going here pretty quickly, and we have a lot to cover. So, again, I like to try to avoid the sit and get and lecture for too many days in a row, but this chapter is covering this in 2 days or so is pretty difficult. So, we're going to have 2 days to review. We'll be reviewing Thursday, tomorrow through theme work, and Friday through your discussion. So don't freak out too much. Just a reminder that this is on Canvas, and the PowerPoint is, so if you need to access it that way, you can. And that way, if you get lost here or you have internet issues or something, or if you'd rather have it on your screen, just follow me. You can do that. It's up to you. All right. So yesterday, I believe we finished off just starting to talk about the feudal system that was created in Western Europe, if I'm not mistaken. Now, that feudal system, the most basic unit of the feudal system was the medieval manor. And I think I had just gotten done explaining how the manor system became common in Western Europe. I need somebody by a raise of hand here to tell me why Europe turned into a feudal area or territory. So let's see who's going to raise their hand. Why did Europe turn to feudalism as a means for their only legitimate government? Somebody tell me. Again, the raise the hand function on the fancy Zoom. Bueller. Anybody? Come on, don't make me cold call here. All right, Kimberly. Kim, tell us.
Was it to protect their land?
All right, so they absolutely needed protection. So it became a means to protect themselves. Good job. Okay. There were three people they were protecting themselves from. Three groups of people. Okay. I need somebody to review that for me. Who were they protecting themselves from after the fall of the Roman Empire? Raise your hand on the fancy button. Hannah.
The Muslims, oh my gosh. Hold on, wait, I have it. The Muslims, the Mayans, and the Vikings.
All right, so the Muslims, the Vikings, and the Magyars. Yes, okay, good. So that need for protection meant that society became bogged down in this ever-growing world of feudalism where there was very little social mobility, and because of that, the church became the dominant political and religious force in Western Europe. And so it was to the church and the Christian church that Western Europe started to look for guidance. And so not only did they create the moral standards, and they also created some of the law codes that people had to follow. That law code that they created is called canon law. C-A-N-O-N, canon law. That comes from the word, canon, canonical. It means law for everybody. And so the church law became dominant, and the church, through collecting tithes, T-I-T-H-E-S, okay, if you guys have ever heard of that before, that's giving the first 10% of what you make to the church. Church became extremely wealthy, owning up to 30% of the land in Western Europe. The Christian church, 30% of the land. and peasants worked that land, and they paid them the taxes, and they became lords over large estates, while also becoming part of the church and working for the Christian church. All right. So because of this, and I have this on here, there was kind of a power play then at hand between this person known as the Holy Roman Emperor and other powerful lords and the church. And if you look on the bottom right, you're going to see the pyramid. Kind of, we showed you guys this yesterday. But the church kind of had its own separate place on the pyramid where their structure and those who worked for the clergy were oftentimes considered separate and not able to be dictated by the nobles, the lord, or eventually the monarchs or the kings. The church then also preserved learning, and that was done through the growing presence of monasteries and the study of what's called monasticism. Okay. And in these monasteries, they were different according to the different areas in Europe that they came about. But monasteries were considered places where second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth born sons would go from wealthy families, because once they lived there for a certain period of time and were trained in the church ways, then they had an opportunity to go from there to rise up in the Catholic Church, because they know they weren't going to get the family birthright and the family lands, because that would go to the eldest son. So it was monks who figured out how to cultivate seeds, keep bees, make honey, keep sheep, cattle, pigs. And they were self-sufficient areas, and they had their own breweries, their own wineries. And so it was oftentimes people were so hungry that the monasteries would be places where they would go to get food. They became involved in trade. They also had some women there serving as nuns. And you start to see a way for women to get involved in the church also. Okay. This is the day of a medieval monk. Who was it? Who I see? I think I'm looking at a Griffin Moore on the screen. He had his hand on his face, kind of like his brother Quinn used to, and he looked like he might be falling asleep on me. So Quinn, or not Quinn, but Griffin, I want you to think about having to have to live a day like this. This is a typical day for a monk in a monastery. Okay, the green is sleeping. So in the summer, you get up at 1:30, you meditate, you go to church for an hour and a half, you sleep for half an hour, you go to church for an hour, meditate for an hour, go to church for an hour, meditate for an hour, go to church for an hour and a half, work your obligatory thing, whatever you guys made on that monastery, and then you get one meal for an hour, you get to sleep for an hour and a half, and then you're back to church, 2.5 hours of work, small dinner, and you can see another hour and a half of church, half-hour meditation, final prayers, and you go to sleep at 8:30 and get up at 1:30 and do that again 6 days a week. I do not think you guys would do – I wouldn't do very well with that. In the winter, you guys can see they go to bed at 6:30, get up at 2:30, so you get a little more sleep, but that would be a challenging day. Here is what we call a medieval monastery, a scriptorium, where the only reproducing of books was done in these monasteries. You can see the lighting was poor. They're trying to copy books. And so that's one of the reasons why education and literacy rates were extremely low, was only the people that were trained in Latin really could read, and there weren't a lot of books around. If you guys are in my room, I'm looking at it right now. I have the Book of Kells. Yeah, I think I have a portion of it up here. This is from the Book of Kells, which was produced in the 9th century, so 800s. And it's in the Trinity College in the library there, and it's one of the first books that they have. And these are called illuminated manuscripts. So they were a production of art. They had pictures in them to kind of depict what was going on. And then you can see how fancy the writing was. And that was one of the reasons why it took so long to produce a book. Nice. Yeah. All right. Moving on here then. Because there was a kind of confusion of who was the leader, the Pope became the leader of Western Europe. And essentially, you could look at the idea that the Pope was the new emperor of Western Europe, replacing the Roman emperor. But his authority grew. So I kind of already explained canon law, but the Pope and the cardinals and the clergy had the ability to excommunicate, which meant you couldn't have sacraments. They collected tithes. And if you guys know, the Christian church and the Roman Catholic church are growing to having 7 sacraments. I know some of you went to Catholic schools. You probably know all 7 of them. But in order to perform sacraments, let's say to bury your child or have them baptized or bury a parent, you had to pay the church fees to do that. So the church became more and more powerful and wealthy as well. Pope Gregory the Seventh was the one that declared that the Pope and the position of the Pope was infallible. Okay. Do you guys know what the word infallible is? Can you guys, anybody want to explain what the word infallible means to me, please? Looking for somebody to participate. Infallible.
Does it mean like the church like can't be defeated, or like there's nothing stronger than the church that could bring it down?
That's a good way of putting it. That's a good way to remember it. So incapable of falling. It would be maybe one way to look at it. But and I got a question: does that have to do anything with the word fallacy? Incapable of being wrong. And so the Pope stands as a person between God and man, as an intermediary, but God has made the Pope infallible, meaning they cannot be wrong. And so because they're between God and man, and so thus you have to do what the Pope says. The Pope is more powerful than the kings because the kings are not placed by God. The kings have their positions because they're given them by the Pope. Okay, so that makes the Pope infallible. That's one of the issues we'll see shortly that Martin Luther is going to have a big problem with. All right, let's keep going here. So it is this tithing then that leads to communities and these cities that start to develop to have a lot of pride in their church. And that develops alongside the artistic movement that comes about in the 1100s and 1200s known as Gothic art. And so you can easily see the difference here between the Byzantine churches that you looked at yesterday and a couple examples here of Gothic art. You've got the Notre Dame, which obviously burned down some last year here in Paris. And then in Milan, oh gosh, what do they call this church? The Duomo? Oh, I don't know. I've been there twice. I should probably know this. It's beautiful. It took forever to build, like 400 years. It's the best part about it is there's a golden McDonald's right next to it that literally has a gold roof. It's so fancy, so over the top. Milan is the fashion capital of the world, but in the middle of Milan, the heart of Milan, sits this absolutely beautiful cathedral, which is a very, very good sign and excellent sign of Gothic art. Here's my Homerism here. I'm a homeboy to Germany sometimes. So the dome in Cologne is also a good example. These aren't the best pictures. And then the tallest church in Europe is the Ulmer Münster, which is just another word for cathedral in Ulm, Germany, between Bavaria and Stuttgart. And you guys can see how these peasants who had no money, but yet were still paying heavy taxes and putting pride into these churches because that's what they thought was their ability to go to heaven. Okay, and so again we have this idea that the more money you pay, the closer you're going to get to go into heaven. Someone asked me, do they serve better McDonald's meals there because it's fancier? They really don't. It just costs more. It's not any better. It's actually just the same. All right, so that kind of covers the power of the church. So after the early Middle Ages, and what some people would call the Dark Ages, but that's a very biased way to say it because it was only the Dark Ages in Europe. It wasn't the Dark Ages in China, as we talked about. Tang was flourishing. It wasn't the dark ages in Arabia with the expansion of Islamic culture in the city of Baghdad. But in Europe, it was. And so Europe's going to break out of that. And there's a few things that we're going to look at here. First off is what we call the Spanish Reconquista. And so this is the attempt by Christian Europeans, knights from all over Europe were called to aid and assist in taking back the Iberian Peninsula, which if you guys remember right from your geography quiz, that's modern day Spain and Portugal from the Muslims. And so the Muslims, if you remember, we haven't really talked about this too much, but by 750, remember they had taken all of Spain and they had the Battle of Tours. We talked about that yesterday, 732. Was their furthest advance, but they controlled Spain. And so by 1150, the Christians had captured over half of Muslim Spain, and the church was, again, sending knights and paying for it. And then in 1492, the city of Granada fell, which was the last Muslim stronghold, and that would be kind of the start also of what we call the Spanish Inquisition. And then it also would be the union of Castile and Aragon. Those were two kingdoms, which would create the country of Spain. Okay, the union of Castile and Aragon, which would be Ferdinand and Isabella. You guys have probably heard of them before. All right. Let's move on to this thing known as the Crusades. Okay, so you guys can see a map here. Remember, I had you guys read a speech yesterday. I believe it was from 1096. That's off the top of my head. I think it's correct, though. And so that was the Pope giving this speech at the Council of Clermont. If you guys look on the map, it wasn't as easy to really decipher Europe at that time as all being Christian, because remember, you had Orthodox Christianity, Latin or Roman Christians, and then you also then had in the orange is the spread of Islam and Muslim dominated areas. And so you see Jerusalem in the bottom right hand side of that map, it was controlled by the Muslims and had been for at that point over 300, 400 years. Okay, so you guys can see the routes that the Crusaders took here. No, they didn't travel by plane or train or cars. They walked on paths that traversed through these areas and then hopped on ships. And no, they had no money. And so it was not a very organized effort, to say the least. Before we move on here, trying to budget time as I can, let's talk about what you guys read yesterday. I know that speech might have seemed long. I usually use that. I used to use that as a 9 weeks test, and people would write it out. We'd write a short answer question on it, but obviously not this year. Question for you though. Why would people have gone on the Crusades? Like, what would have been the motivation here? Let's talk about at least 3 things. Okay, let's use the old hand raise function so I know you're out there. I'm not looking at everyone's screen right now. We got Lucy H, Lucy M, and then HH. Go ahead. Lucy H, what do you got?
People wanted to like join the Crusades because the Pope was like, they're like these like barbarians trying to like steal your land, and if you want like God to praise you or go to heaven, you better like fight for what like you were born into and what like God put into you.
Okay. And you said protect your land. So that was this whole idea that they need to protect their lands from the Muslims. And he uses a lot of discriminatory language against the Muslims. They don't even know really who they are. Good. Lucy M., what do you got?
So I think that like this kind of goes with what Lucy said, but so like they kept talking about God and how like we should do all of this for God and to like make God happy. And it also says like it is the will of God a lot, and I think that just really shows like how much they just want to do everything to make God happy in a way.
Yeah, and didn't it seem to you that the Pope was trying to use his position of power to get people to do this too?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, we had Hannah Hiddle. What do you think?
Yeah, and along with him like using his power, he was also really like accentuating or like really putting emphasis on how important the Holy Land was to like them, and yeah, for them to protect their land, and how like make like doing this would like create like this deeper connection with God. And it was talking about how it would like help like banish your or like get rid of your sins, like almost like forgive your sins. So that could have been a motive too.
That is a big one right there. So people who were wealthy and in the upper class and were landowners felt like they were already going to heaven because they could afford to have their sacraments and appease the Catholic Church. But it was these lower knights, peasants, and people that were displaced in society that saw this as an amazing opportunity, because if they died on the way, if you caught it in the speech, the Pope offered remission of sins. So that means forgiveness of sins and direct admittance into heaven, where you don't have to sit in purgatory and work off all of the horrible things that you did during your lifetime. Okay? And so this was an unbelievable opportunity. And so the majority of people who joined in on these crusades, and especially at the beginning, were poor as dirt people looking for adventure, looking for excitement, looking to own land, and maybe some lower class knights, lower lords, and they absolutely embarrassed themselves, okay, because of it. If you catch on to the Pope kind of calls out all of his constituents. That means the people that he's over, and says, you guys are, I mean, if this were like 2020 and he was using Donald Trump speak, he'd be like, y'all are a bunch of morons. You're just fighting with each other. You sound stupid. Like, stop being idiots. Stop fighting each other. You can't even walk down the street without being robbed. Like, come on, guys. Stop being stupid, and some kind of language like that. Like, this is the Pope basically spitting his game, saying, man, you guys are just being dumb. Like, let's do something. Let's go get our land. And so you got to see this from multiple perspectives. We'll talk about that here in a second. All right. So I hope you guys read that. Definitely to your advantage if you did. So let's go back to the background real quick of the Crusades. Not a new concept, been used. Clovis did it against the people of Gaul who were not Christians. Charlemagne did it against the Saxons. The French tried to kick out the Muslims out of Spain. And so this was just, again, the idea that now they had a common goal. This was to unite Western Christianity and Western Europe. And one common goal is to go get the Crusader lands, or what was known as Jerusalem and lands around it. Okay? So the only crusade that was relatively successful was the First Crusade, after 10,000 peasants and knights got slaughtered, basically in modern day Turkey, because in Syria, because they tried to attack walled cities using pots and pans and crude metal tools, and the Muslims thought it was an absolute joke. And then when they realized that they were serious, they just slaughtered them. But then the European knights came back. You have relative success, and there are Crusader states that are then set up. Okay, you can see the Crusader states here. So the knights that went on these adventures and that helped take over the Promised Land got to keep their own estates. They became lords. They ruled over the people on those lands in the farmland, and this would not last for very long. Okay, you can see where Edessa is, where the Turks were. They took over Edessa by 1144, so within 50 years, states already started to disappear. So then they call for the Second Crusade, the Third Crusade, a Fourth Crusade. At one point, the Holy Roman Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa and his knights went. He drowned in a river in the Balkan Peninsula. Philip II left from France, and he ends up making it to the Holy Land, but he's pissed at the English king, William the Conqueror, because William stops in Cyprus, which right here is on the map. It's that little island in the Mediterranean. And he actually has an affair with the Queen of Cyprus and then claims that territory for England on his way there. And so it wasn't very pretty, and it wasn't organized. And so none of those crusader states stand. And I told you yesterday, by the Fourth Crusade, they sack Constantinople, steal a bunch of items, and they end up weakening Constantinople to the point where it doesn't last for another 100 years after that. Okay, so these definitely backfire on the Pope. Okay, so the effect of the Crusades, less authority for the Pope. People are going to start questioning him. It ends up being a huge economic success for Western Europeans. Okay, so Arabic numerals, algebra, medicine, a lot of the Greek works from Herodotus, Aristotle, made their way to Europe through the Muslims and through the Crusades. This definitely spurs trade in the Mediterranean, and Italy and Italian city-states, they weren't united. They had a huge advantage. And then lords, who had a lot of power, now they were no longer going to have nearly the amount of power because standing armies and professional soldiers were now more important and more powerful. And new weapons that came from the Muslim world, like the crossbow, even the cannon, would make knights obsolete, and the power of the Lord to provide knights for protection not necessarily all that valuable. All right, so obviously the Crusades, we could talk a whole semester about it, but we're not going to. We got to hustle. All right, so let's kind of usher us into what we would call the High Middle Ages and see these are some different developments then that ensue. Okay, we've already talked about the Holy Roman Empire. That is not going to be connected. Okay, it's not holy nor Roman, nor is it an empire. Not holy because it's secular leaders. Secular means of the world. It's not Roman because it's not where the Roman Empire was. It's where modern day Germany, Poland, and part of France is. And it's not an empire because they weren't really that connected. Okay, Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, will not become unified until the year 1871. That's a long time. The Holy Roman Empire becomes an actual country. France, on the other hand, and the Capetian family, Louis Capet, is able to consolidate the area around Paris and then spread out using his lords and giving allegiances to his lord. And France is able to become a kind of a nation state much earlier. Italy is broken up. Italy is not unified until the 1860s either. And that's because they are dominated by city-states. Rome and the Papal States, Venetia, Genoa, Firenze, Florence, Milan. Okay, powerful families like the Medicis and the Sforzas are going to create these basically trading monopolies on certain products. And they control the trade that with France and what's called Flanders, which is French Belgium area, northern French, all the way down to Italy. And then they control the ships that sail to the Eastern Mediterranean and pick up goods that are traded along the Silk Trade Route. And so the Italian states don't want to unify because they like to make their money, and they're constantly kind of in battle for who's going to be more powerful. In Venice, you have the doges, etc. And that's why when we talk about the Renaissance, that's why each city looks a little bit different and has their own individual characteristics. All right, so if you take a look at the map, one thing I think is you guys are going to notice, I told you Hungary and Poland are actually kingdoms in the Middle Ages, which are rarely ever talked about. But the reason why they're rarely ever talked about is they end up getting swallowed up by Russia, spit out by Russia, taken over by Germany, spit out by Germany, and vice versa. Basically all the way up until, 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, fairly recently. The Holy Roman Empire, you guys see this massive green blob in the middle here? That's awkward, okay? Because, again, I told you guys, it doesn't actually become a country, and it's a patchwork of a bunch of different states, very loosely connected by these group of electors who got to say who they wanted to be the next Holy Roman Emperor. All right, moving on. You guys talked about this a little bit yesterday, and I'm going to have to go a lot faster. But the rise of monarchy in England. England was also feudal. You had native peoples there mixed with the Angles and the Saxons. That's why I call it the Anglo-Saxon people sometimes. Maybe you guys have heard of the word WASPy before, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's typically if you call someone WASPy, that's like you're making fun of them for being a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That term comes from England, and it is a Protestant, I mean, not Catholic. Anglo-Saxon is the tradition. The Angles and the Saxons migrated to England, and then obviously they're white. Okay, so that's where that tradition comes from. So you had people trying to take over England and Great Britain, as well as Viking raids, and at the same time you had people from France who wanted to control England. And so the only time England was successfully invaded and the entire area was conquered was not Julius Caesar or not a Roman emperor. It was William of Normandy, okay, at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Okay, Hitler couldn't, and Germans in the Luftwaffe could not defeat England and couldn't successfully invade it. Okay, neither could the Spanish in the 1588 and the Spanish Armada. But in 1066, England fell to someone of Viking descent. Okay, and then English kings would come from that line from then on. Now, the feudal state was similar to Western Europe, but in 1215, one of the weakest kings in history, King John, was forced to sign what's known as the Great Charter. Okay, I had you guys read this. I hope you kind of got to understand why this was a huge development in government for Western culture, Western history. But they created the parliamentary system, meaning there was legislative bodies that were meant to check the power of the king, the upper house and the lower house. Parliament had to approve taxes, which is a direct check on the power of the king. The King of England now had to recognize that his ability to be king was a fief from the Pope. So the Pope now established his authority and power over the king. And just so you guys understand, this does not create a democratic system. Okay? It just puts a check on the power of the English king and puts the Pope above him. Okay? Most of you have probably heard of King Henry VIII. That'll be this way until the late 1500s, when then England will formally split from Roman Catholicism. All right, so that's 800 years ago, and you still have people in countries around the world that are still struggling to get rid of dictators and are still struggling to have similar rights. Okay, and so that's why it's such an important concept in world history. All right. So the second half of the Middle Ages, what's called the High Middle Ages, you have population growth. You have an improvement in farming. The mold board is a good example of that. I don't know if you'll ever remember that, but it's just like an iron attachment they put on the soil because the soil was kind of crummy and rocky. That allowed them to grow more. You can see on the map here, from 1800 to 1500, you have approximately 3 times the population. And then when there's more people around, you're going to have the growth of cities, which completely undermines the whole idea of feudalism. And so as towns developed, at first lords liked it because they made money off trade and off the towns. But then as the towns grew larger and larger, lords became more obsolete and cities became where people wanted to live because there was economic opportunity inside cities. All right, we got to I'm going to have to pick out what I want to skip through here. So specialization of labor, basically economic revival happens through more jobs, different kinds of jobs. And then also you start to see more trade routes develop. So the trans-Saharan trade route, so Europe is connected to Africa. We're talking about that tomorrow through the Golden Salt trade, Silk trade route. And then also the Hanseatic League in northern Germany and Denmark, in Belgium, that's going to create a trade route in northern Europe. All right. Here's the idea of the trade routes that started to develop. You'll notice how Italy benefited quite a bit. And then up here in the north, you're going to notice the Flanders is what it's called, the wool markets, and then towns that could hold fairs where they would do a lot of their trading once a year. Hanseatic League, again, you can see that on the top here. All right, women started to gain more respect over time, okay? Whereas in Islamic culture, we're going to talk about, you've got women started to gain more rights. They could actually work in guilds as skilled craftsmen. And the idea that the Mother Mary, who sacrificed her child, was to be worshipped in the Catholic Church, also brought some improvement for the lives of women. All right, Christianity then changes a little bit as after the Crusades because you have the works of Aristotle. And so one person in particular, Thomas Aquinas, introduced the idea that you have to be able to prove things. And so Thomas Aquinas and the whole idea of scholasticism proved that you can rectify and reason with Christianity and logic. All right. And you can fuse those two together. And so he's somebody that's still read often to this day. And he's going to inspire a lot of the ideas that people like Jan Hus and Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin and Martin Luther will when they create the Protestant Revolution, okay, Reformation. All right, let's get to the end of this whole thing. You guys have heard of the Black Plague before. I'm sure you've talked about it, and in terms of the pandemic that we have spreading right now. Okay, we had 918 cases and 18 deaths today, again in Indiana. That's not as large as the Black Plague, which killed approximately 25 million people and a fourth of the population in Europe. It took 200 years to catch up to the amount of people that died. Okay. Here you can see a map where it's spread, and it's spread. This is over about a 3-year period, 1347 to 1350. Okay. It's unbelievable. Okay. And the only reason it doesn't spread to the areas in the gray was they were outside of the trade routes. Anywhere though there was trade routes, you had exposure and no remedies. And the remedies, you can see famous quote from Boccaccio. He's the writer. He's the Black Plague writer. Was victims ate lunch with their ancestors and victims ate lunch with their friends and family and dinner with their ancestors, because that's how fast it spread and killed. All right, this ends up having a huge impact on the European economy. And because labor became so scarce, peasants now could demand being paid in wages and not just in farmland. You've got inflation occurs because people can't really pay, and so they start kind of printing more money. Money becomes less valuable. And this is going to lead to this whole idea of like the capitalist economy where people can try to charge more money to get things. Okay. And if you read the quote, if you have time later, it turns into kind of the path for the Industrial Revolution is after this. And this whole concept of mercantilism. Okay. You don't need to know all that much. The 100 Years' War fought between England and France, and the two families that controlled it. England and the Normans controlled Normandy. They invaded Paris. They controlled it. And this was an off and on series of battles. But what ended up happening was, in the end, the French won, and the British sued for peace in the year 1436. Wasn't officially over until 1453, and every European nation state at that time got involved with it as well. And then this is when basically standing armies and paying for standing armies instead of just knights really undermined feudalism also. All right. Last but not least, the Renaissance then is going to come out of this, and that because of the growth that occurred after the Crusades and after the Black Death. You've got more ideas coming into Europe. You've got Muslim ideas and Muslim advances in science from India and China that make their way to Europe. And you've got less people, more wages. And then when Constantinople falls, that in 1453, that's going to add to this Renaissance. What I told you guys is the rebirth, and Europe's going to grow and expand after this. All right. Okay. We'll talk more about that later. Obviously, I'm going to hit that in a different chapter. So I think I made it. I did. Awesome. That was a lot. Okay. The last thing I want to do, I know I've got 1 minute left. You have very, very short homework tonight. Okay. You can start on your notes that I sent out on Remind yesterday for next week if you want to. But you guys will see your name here, and you're going to see a number. Okay? What I need you to do is whatever number you are next to, that's the theme that I want you to take notes on tonight. Okay? I've got the 6 themes in front of me. Whatever number is next to that theme, that is the number for you to look at this evening, and be ready to get together in a group tomorrow because we have a short class period tomorrow due to sophomore personal project. I think it's like 35-minute classes or less. Okay. All right. The bell rang. I'm going to have other people joining really fast, and it messes it up if I don't end this. So anyone have any questions for me? If it's content related, we'll talk about it tomorrow.
Can you repeat what we have to what we're going to be discussing with the themes, everything that we learned today, or
everything we learned today and that you read about, in the last 2 days, and what you read about. And that's what the discussion will do over also.
Okay.
And this lesson will be posted, right? So we can go back and look at go through the notes again.
Yeah, and the notes are on Canvas also.
Canvas, yeah.
Yep.
Okay. It just sometimes you say different stuff than the slideshow. Usually it's more it's just more to the point. So it's nice to have both.
Yeah, it's a lot to cover in one. It's just a lot to cover. I'm trying to do my best I can. So you are correct on that. All right, anybody else? You guys are all free to leave if you want to. Get to your next class. All right. Have a good day, everyone.